This video is the first of a six-part series about the Great Migration of the African American population from the South from about 1915 to 1970. The videos are intended in part to act as a handout and supplement to the one-hour in-person class presented at RootsTech 2023. Subsequently, some of the same information provided in the one-hour class is included but amplified by these videos. There is also a printed handout available that contains the script of the in-person class and each of the 6 individual series videos with footnotes to each source and an extensive bibliography. The videos are presented in sequence and are best viewed in order. Each of the videos highlights an individual or a family that was involved in leaving the South and moving to a city in the North, the West, or the Northeast. The cities are selected based on the numbers of migrants. Each individual or family was gleaned from the 1950 U.S. Census and then researched back in time to discover their origins with genealogically valuable records. The family chosen for this video lived in Chicago. Quoting Alex Haley, the author of Roots, "In all of us there is a hunger, marrow deep, to know our heritage, to know who we are and where we have come from. Without this enriching knowledge, there is a hollow yearning. No matter what our attainments in life, there is still a vacuum, an emptiness, and the most disquieting loneliness." The Great Migration between 1915 and 1970, when over 6 million African Americans moved from the southern states to other parts of the country, is one of the most dramatic movements of people in the United States that has ever occurred. It is almost completely ignored by historians and is unknown to most genealogists. The term Great Migration is used by genealogists and historians for 2 different time periods. The first is from Britain to America from 1620 to 1640. And the second refers to the migration from the southern states to the northern states, which is said to have begun around 1915 and lasted until about 1970. Of course, there was some movement out of the South before 1915 and after 1970, but the mass movement occurred during those years. Understanding the African American Great Migration may help to explain difficult family history research issues that occur when an individual seems to suddenly appear in the North or other part of the country or disappear suddenly from the South. If you have ancestors or relatives that seem to appear in a place in the Northwest or Northeast of the United States, but may have originally come from the southern part of the United States in the 1900s, it is likely they were part of the Great Migration. Whenever we begin genealogical research about a migrant or an immigrant, discovering the place of origin of the migrant or immigrant often becomes the ultimate end of the line or brick wall. Over the years, as I have helped people with their genealogical research, the most common obstacle to overcome has always been the origin of the migrant or immigrant. Tracing your ancestors back in time to their origins in the southern states can be a challenge. My presentation focuses on the people and records from the 20th century and the difficulty in connecting the individuals and families to the places they were living at the turn of the century. In moving from one geographical area to another, many migrants shed their old ways and adopt new ones. Sometimes historical records fail to completely reflect the realities of the changes because of cultural and record preservation issues. There was no organized mass movement. The Great Migration consisted of the decisions of individuals and families to leave the South and move to another area of the country that promised relief from the oppression and danger of living under Jim Crow laws and practices. It is only through looking at the lives of those who made their own decision to leave the South and spend their lives in another extremely different way and place that we can begin to understand the why and how of the Great Migration. My emphasis is to show how we begin learning about those individuals' lives. The key to successful research into the lives of both migrants and immigrants is to start in the country or place of arrival. In the 1900s in the United States, there are numerous records that may help in determining the place of origin. Granted, discovering the lives of African Americans is sometimes very challenging, especially as you try to trace them into the 1800s. But success in doing research in the 1800s is predicated on complete and thorough research in the 1900s. To begin to understand the Great Migration, I must recommend the most influential history of the movement that has been written so far. The book is written as a narrative history and is called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. This is an essential book for any understanding of the motives, the conditions, the suffering, and the anguish that accompanied this movement. Quoting from the historian Neil Macmillan as quoted in the book, "The story of the Great Migration is among the most dramatic and compelling in all chapters of American history. So far-reaching are its effects that even now we scarcely understand its meaning." Please be aware that in talking about these historical events or quoting from historical records, the language and terminology may be offensive to some. This also applies to images from that time period. It is also important to be culturally sensitive when interviewing, investigating, and reporting on research done. People who were forced to leave their homes are often reticent to talk about their suffering. Likewise, there are significant attempts by those who caused the suffering to ignore or erase this history. Keep this in mind when researching any migrant community. In addition, part of the challenge of talking about these events arises from the question of terminology. Here's a quote from an article from the University of Alabama at Huntsville entitled, "Which is the correct terminology, Black, African American, or people of color?" Quote, "It depends. Black refers to dark-skinned people of African descent, no matter their nationality. African American refers to people who were born in the United States and have African ancestry. Many people use the terms interchangeably. To say you are a person of color is more celebratory and positive than to say you are part of a minority. All three terms are acceptable. Which you prefer comes down to personal choice, the situation you're in, and how invested you are in your racial history." End of quote. Although slavery had technically ended at the end of the Civil War, the oppression of the African American population continued unabated. Many of the formerly enslaved people became indentured servants or sharecropping tenant farmers living under the same or worse conditions as they had suffered under slavery. The severe economic exploitation of the blacks in the South began during the Jim Crow era in about 1880. The subsequent passage of extremely complicated segregation laws created a society of terror among the former enslaved people, which included the threat of systematic violence and the complex imposition of political disenfranchisement. These factors made unbearable living conditions for nearly all the formerly enslaved people. Unless you have studied this period of American history, you cannot imagine the degree of poverty and the suffering that existed in the Black population of the southern states. Unfortunately, many of the Black people in America are still suffering the same imposed and limiting conditions. An example of the pervasive terrorism that existed in the South is the fact that between 1880 and 1950, an African American was lynched with impunity of prosecution of the perpetrators more than once a week for some perceived breach of the racial hierarchy. Jim Crow existed for almost 100 years, from the post-Civil War era until the beginning of the civil rights laws in the 1960s. These Jim Crow laws were meant to marginalize and oppress African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws were often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. Escape from the oppression of these laws was a major factor in the movement of the African American population. Despite an abundance of records in the 20th century, there are some important issues that arise because genealogical research may involve people who are still living and have privacy rights, or may involve documents that are not readily available due to other restrictions. The recent release of the 1950 U.S. Census after 72 years is a good example. With the information in the 1950 census, we can begin to document more of the movement from the South. In this first video, in the 6 video series that are essentially the handout for my 1-hour presentation at RootsTech 2023, as I did in my live presentation, I will be researching a family chosen from the 1950 U.S. Federal Census found on Ancestry.com. Preparation of the slides for RootsTech 2023 had to be completed before some of the other genealogy websites had completely searchable copies of the 1950 census, so my options were limited. But I was able to use the other genealogical websites for research in the earlier census records. The screenshot images are taken from the websites where the information was organized and recorded. Roscoe Brown was 28 years old and born in Alabama as found in the 1950 U.S. Census. He was living in Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, with his wife, Freddie, age 26, who was born in Illinois, and his brother, William G. Brown, age 30, who was separated from his wife and was also born in Alabama. Roscoe was formerly employed as grinder and polisher at a tile manufacturing company, but at the time of the census, he was unemployed. His wife, Freddie, worked as a condenser maker for a manufacturer. His brother, William, worked as an elevator operator in a meatpacking plant. They were living in a second-floor apartment located at 3634 Prairie Avenue. A search of the adjacent pages of the census records did not find any Browns living close by. A search on Ancestry.com almost immediately found a World War II draft registration card for Roscoe Brown, showing his birth date as 11 July 1921 in Coker, Alabama. His next of kin was identified as his brother William. At that time, they were living at 3327 Calumet Avenue, Chicago. His employer at the time of the registration was U.H. Christman, located at 568 Washington, also in Chicago. Each record found gives us more information leading to additional records that might be available. Draft registration records are not commonly used by many genealogists, but they often solve the immediate question of a birth date and a place of birth. Finding a birthplace is not usually this fast or easy. Coker, Alabama is a small town in Tuscaloosa County. Its 2020 population was 904. The population appears to be declining from previous census records. This is a street view of the local African Methodist Episcopal Church in Coker. With the names of 2 or 3 family members, we can search for the family in previous census records. It is a good idea to trace all the members of each family in all the census records. The additional information will help in moving back in time into the 1800s. I was able to find Roscoe Brown in the 1940 U.S. Census living with an aunt named Annie Sanders in Northport City, Tuscaloosa County, Alabama. At this point, more research would need to be done to verify that this is the same person living in Chicago in the 1950 census. Roscoe was working as a porter for a private family, essentially a servant. Further research in the 1930 U.S. Census found the entire family living in Taylorsville, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, giving the names of the parents and additional siblings. This takes us back to Roscoe and William's father, Andrew, who was born in about 1896. We still have several questions to resolve, such as a marriage record and maiden name of Roscoe's wife, Freddie. Andrew Brown's wife is named Laura, born in Mississippi, and we need to find her maiden name. But by using the U.S. Census records and other available records, we now have a beginning of a window into the 1800s. With the names of Roscoe and William Brown's parents, we can look back to the 1920 U.S. Census and beyond. Andrew and Laura Brown were born in Alabama and Mississippi. In 1930, Andrew was 34 years old and was 23 when they got married. Laura was 30 years old and got married when she was 19 years old. It is probable that they had additional children who had already left home by 1930. Andrew was also shown to be a farm laborer. Additional research is needed to answer the question about the maiden names of the women in the families, and additional information about Andrew and his wife's origins, including possible marriage records. As is the case with all such research, the focus should be wider than searching for individuals by name. The main focus should be on the locations where the events occurred, supported by the relevant contemporary records. Andrew would have only been about 20 or so years old at the start of World War I, so he should have had a draft registration card that could identify his date and place of birth and perhaps the name of one of his parents. Every record discovered suggests additional records that could be used to find additional information about the family. Learning about the Great Migration continues. There is really no end to the research that can be done and the discoveries that can be made. The next video, number 2 in the series, will continue with research about a family beginning in New York. Thanks for watching.